Alex here with a high conflict child custody video on child support waivers. So my last two videos I covered some contract principles that just kind of hopefully help people understand not just that contracts can be voided or ignored, but the reason behind it. Because if I just went into this video saying, yeah, you can agree to this stuff, but the court's going to just throw it out, people are just going to feel like it's not fair and they're not going to understand why. So try and watch the previous two videos, and hopefully that helps you understand kind of a basis as to why the things that I'm about to say are not only real, but they make sense. So the child support waivers, and we're just going to go into two examples, and then I'm going to go into, I'm probably not going to go into the technical details of why the law is what it is. Let's go into the examples and see where I go from there. So the first example that I have is this couple. I read this case. I think it was a husband and wife. It may have not been. It may have been a child custody case, not a divorce case. Anyway, they agreed that there would be no child support. And I think a few years later, 2 or 3 or 4 years later, one of the two people filed a motion to modify child support and basically make it go from no child support to pay me child support. And the other person felt like it wasn't fair, and they fought it. And if I remember correctly, the judge agreed with them, but it went to the Supreme Court and they reversed. Basically, the Supreme Court said, yeah, we see that they agreed to not having to pay child support, but under the law, you can review a child support order, every 3 years, and the law overrides whatever agreement they came up with in court. And this video, I hope, helps people understand that there are certain statutory rights and principles that you cannot agree your way out of. I mentioned in the beginning of the video I wasn't going to go into explaining maybe the political reasons as to why, because then there's just going to be a bunch of arguments. I just want people to know that this does happen. And if you have an attorney, ask them about it. And if you don't, try and do some research. If there is a statute that says you can modify child support if you do these 3 or 4 things, you can't just go into court and say, Your Honor, we're going to agree to never having to pay child support, and then expect that to override the law. You can't just come up with someone. I mean, there's a difference between waiving a right you have, and then there's a difference between overriding the law. And even though child support obviously ends up, it's money in your pocket, that law, it serves public policy in a way that the government simply will not allow it to be just waived. That money is to help you raise a child. And there are other things that come into play when it comes to child support. For example, if a person goes and gets food stamps or TANF, which is money, cash support, the government has a right to get your money from your ex first to help you take care of yourself and your kid before they just fork over money out of a welfare system. So, I mean, it's one thing if you're going to waive your right to alimony, because that's just you. You're a wife, you're a spouse, and you're entitled to alimony, and you're going to waive it. But it's another thing to try and bypass this legal framework that isn't just for you. Yeah, you get the cash, but it's for your kids. It's just a whole different type of situation. You just don't have full control over that because it's, as I mentioned, it's first off, it's not just you, it's for your kids. But also, if you end up in welfare, getting welfare assistance, now the government has to pay all this extra money that it wouldn't have to pay if you were getting child support. So, I mean, these are legitimate public policy issues. You can't just waive that. The other case that I saw was one where it was the other way around. So the first one I just mentioned was both people agreed there would be no child support. The other one was this guy. He was like a stockbroker, and he was making like $1 million a year or some insane amount of money. And he agreed to pay his ex a certain amount of money for child support. It was a lot. It was like $10,000 or $20,000 a month. But he was making so much that it was, it was within the child support formulas, and I don't know if it was exactly 18% or whatever. That's, I don't know those kinds of details. All I know is he was making a lot of money, and he agreed to paying a lot of child support, and he also agreed to not being able to modify it, which is weird. But anyway, 3 years later, he wasn't a stockbroker anymore. I'm not sure if this was around the 2008 collapse. Maybe it was. And he was making way less money, like way, way less money. And he filed a motion to modify child support. And the judge agreed with his ex in saying that you agreed to not modifying child support, so now you're stuck with this. And I think the judge did throw him a bone. I think the judge said something like, if you can show that you're unable to pay at a contempt of court hearing, then you won't be fined or thrown in jail. Well, the Supreme Court didn't even like that. I mean, that wasn't enough of a bone to throw him. The Supreme Court mentioned the same thing that they mentioned in their other case, which was, even though you agreed to having to pay this insane amount of money and now you've lost your job, you can't override the statutory system. And the statutory system takes into consideration changes in circumstances such as a change in your job. So again, the Supreme Court basically voided that agreement that they came up with in court and allowed the guy to modify his child support, even though he agreed that he would never do it, even though he signed a piece of paper. In fact, he signed a stipulation. So it wasn't just a contract, it was a stipulation, which is, as I've mentioned in one of my previous videos, I think it's titled Stipulations. It's basically a court order. It's a contract. Before you go to court, a contract is just a piece of paper. It's just a contract, just an agreement. It's not enforceable yet. It's not until you go to court and that contract gets brought to the court's attention and that contract gets merged into a custodial order or a divorce decree or a judgment or whatever, that it has the force of law behind it to where you can enforce it with contempt of court and stuff like that. Yeah, so this guy did a full-blown stipulation, which became a court order, and still the Supreme Court tossed it. So hopefully this helps people in a way, not just that. I hope it doesn't just teach people to just play like sneaky games and like agree to things that they know are unenforceable to trick their ex. Hopefully it's more of an alert or a caution to people to just be aware that not necessarily everything that is agreed to is going to be enforced later on. You have to look into the case law and try to understand the contract principles behind it, or if there's any public policy principles behind it that would get in the way of your agreement and basically cause it to get tossed. So with that, I'll go ahead and end this video.